Hello everyone, my name is Avatar Ken, and today we're going to talk about Death of the Author. Death of the Author is a term coined by the French literary critic Roland Barthes. Basically, what Death of the Author means is a text or any work of literature is not defined by the author's intention, but the reader's interpretation. Obviously, this also extends to like TV shows, movies, any other format, basically, right? So, the reason I'm talking about this today is basically this. Recently, I did a video where I talked about Sozin from Avatar, how I don't like what the writers later added on to his character. And, I got a couple really good comments that, talked about how they felt about certain other like added elements of Avatar or things that came after the original show. And, it just made me think, do you have to accept that as a fan? And the obvious answer to that, at least from me, is that no, you do not have to accept it. For instance, there's a lot of people in the Avatar community who just straight up refuse to watch Korra. I do think that Korra has some pretty good merits. I personally do like Korra, but I do see what a lot of people are coming from, because you have things like beginnings, and you have things like, the technology and the characters, certain things being different about the world that just might be off-putting to like someone who's an Avatar purist, or someone who just really liked Avatar The Last Airbender and doesn't like all this new stuff. So basically, a lot of people just pretend that it didn't happen. I can get behind that in some cases, but I'm not really the biggest fan of pretend that something doesn't happen. I'm more of the guy who just wants to acknowledge that things happen, but you don't have to like accept it, right? You don't have to like Korra just because it exists, basically, is what I'm saying. Korra still exists. There's no getting around that. There's no point in pretending it doesn't. But just because it exists and you don't like it doesn't mean you have to like it or you have to watch it or enjoy it. That's basically where I draw the line there. But to go back into this theory on Death of the Author, the reason why I made the thumbnail the way that it is because I feel like in a lot of fandoms, specifically Avatar I'm talking about right now, a lot of people will rush to see what the creators or the writers say about a specific episode, character, or any other like writing thing. And I feel like after they make the initial work, Death of the Author applies, right? So for instance, after the last episode of Avatar The Last Airbender, I don't really need any more input from the writers or the creators to tell me how I should feel about the show, right? For instance, a really big point about this is a lot of people do not like that Aang didn't kill Ozai, right? And, obviously within the internal framework of the show, you're supposed to agree with Aang. And if you ask the, writers and creators, they would say that Aang did the right thing, obviously. But it still does rub a lot of people the wrong way. And I feel like that's completely fine. I think that if your interpretation of the show is that Ozai is so irredeemable that Aang is actually doing a disservice by not killing him, or if your takeaway is that Aang is being selfish and he's putting the world in more danger by not just killing him, especially when he has the power to do so, I actually think that there is plenty of evidence within the show that you could use to interpret that in that way. You don't have to go with, oh, well, the show is telling me and the writers are telling me that Aang is doing the right thing. I feel like if you want to say that Aang did a selfish thing, you can, and that's your interpretation of the work. And that's what Death of the Author is for. Death of the Author isn't like you don't have to take it literally. Like, the author can still very much be alive and even very much still be putting out their thoughts on the work. It's just the theory suggests that you don't have to take it seriously, or that the greater interpretation of the work after it's been created is the viewer's interpretation of it. So, another reason why I decided to make this video is that not only with Avatar, but with several other fandoms that I'm a big fan of, like say Star Wars, right? You have like, say, George Lucas's interpretation of what the Star Wars movies are and what they're supposed to be. And then you have a bunch of other people who have worked with him or alongside him and what they think. But I honestly think that, like, sometimes, and Star Wars is a really good example of this, that sometimes what the viewers come up with is just straight up cooler than anything that the creators would have come up with, right? Like, for instance, the character of Boba Fett, right? You know, obviously recently he had a show and they took the helmet off a lot and we got to know a lot about him that we maybe didn't want to know. And I don't think there's a single Star Wars fan alive who would argue that Boba Fett is cooler without the helmet than he is with the helmet, right? We never really necessarily needed to know what Boba Fett was like or like who he was, in my opinion. I feel like learning that just made it weaker than anything we would have dreamt up in our minds. And, you know, obviously there's other franchises. Obviously there's other franchises that have the same applying, right? Like, for instance, I'm a huge Mortal Kombat fan, right? In Mortal Kombat, you know, like with this whole death of the author scenario, I choose to take the games Mortal Kombat 1, not the new one, the one that came out in 1992, all the way to the last one, Armageddon, and I say that that is all that ever happened in the universe, right? And the reason I get to say that is because death of the author, right? Armageddon was decided to be the ending point of that first timeline, and I can acknowledge that other timelines exist and that all the other games exist. I'll acknowledge it. I'm not gonna try to pretend like they don't, but at the same time, the story of these games is what I make it. The story to me is Mortal Kombat 1 in 92 to Armageddon in 2006. That's what happens. There is no other stuff that happens within that story for me. Those games exist, but their plots, the story modes in those games do not matter and they do not interfere with my enjoyment of the first series of games, right? Just like a lot of people enjoy Avatar: The Last Airbender, but they don't enjoy Korra, right? And I'm just saying that that's cool. You're like, whether you enjoy Korra or not, it should not mess with how you interpret the story of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So things in Korra that might contradict things, like beginnings, like contradicting, or maybe not contradicting, but adding elements to what the Avatar is in the lore and the history of the universe, I can acknowledge that those things happened, but they happened in Korra. They did not happen in Avatar. In Avatar, my interpretation is that people learned how to bend the elements from watching, you know, the animals, like the sky bison and the dragons and all that. They learned how to do the things that those animals did. We don't need to know any more than that for the story to be satisfying to me. There's a lot of questions, but I like having questions, right? I don't like having every single answer. And that's the reason why I don't think that authors should be like super excited to share extra information on a work after it's done, right? I feel like they should let their initial work speak for itself. And I think that they should let the fans come to their own conclusions on things. So basically, that's all I wanted to talk about today. In terms of Avatar, I go depth of the author with things that I don't like, or with things that I don't want to acknowledge. The other things exist, sure, but depth of the author is the way that I stay sane as an Avatar fan, a Mortal Kombat fan, a Star Wars fan. It's something that keeps the peace, and it's something that I think keeps franchises interesting. Because over time, like, the more entries you got and the more questions you answer, the less interesting it's going to be anyway. The viewer or the reader or whatever format, the interpretation from them will always be more interesting and more meaningful, in my opinion, after the work is created. So with that being said, everyone, I hope you have a nice day, and please like and subscribe, and Avatar Ken out.